Sheree commenced last year as the inaugural Chief Executive Officer of a new body established by the Australian Bishops and Religious called Catholic Professional Standards Limited. And Sheree will speak further about that. Prior to taking up this position, about this time last year, Sheree has 12 years' experience in executive leadership roles in social services, and a wealth of experience in dealing with stakeholder engagement and management, quality assurance, strategic planning, and policy development. Prior to taking up the present role, Sheree worked with what we call Catholic Care Melbourne, so an archdiocesan social services organisation. And she did that for 6 years and ended up as the Deputy Chief Executive Officer with just one cleric holding the senior role. But a very good friend of Sheree's. One of the other roles that Sheree had for many years in Melbourne was with an organisation called Berry Street, which was an agency that helped to provide support and adoption type roles for children that may have been neglected, looking at fostering or something. So, as I walk out the door, I'm sure you'll enjoy this thing.
Thanks, Jim. Thank you very much. I've been struck over the last couple of days just thinking as speakers have come up that it is very much accepted practice in Australia to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land. So not that I'm on Aboriginal land, but I do want to welcome you in the Indigenous language of Melbourne. So Wominjeka is local language of the Aboriginal people of Melbourne to say welcome. And I also want to start by acknowledging the lifelong trauma of abuse victims, survivors and their families. The failure of the Catholic Church to protect, believe and respond justly to children and vulnerable adults, and the consequent breaches of community trust. While we're here today, not literally because it's the other side of the day, all my staff are asleep at the moment, but they're travelling around Australia consulting not just with church leaders, but with survivors, families and advocates. And that's our acknowledgement to them alongside the acknowledgement of the traditional owners whenever we meet. So that's becoming part of our practice as a new organisation, that we begin with acknowledgement of survivors. Yes, the technology's working. It's a relatively small group, so I'm happy if throughout the course of my presentation, if there's anything that you would like to clarify or question, I'm happy to sort of divert. There isn't a chance for responses and things like that after this session. So I'm happy to hear from people from the floor if there's anything you'd like to clarify. And I will try and not kill you by PowerPoint. But I am going to give you some data that came from the Royal Commission and from the Church in Australia itself, which hopefully helps to explain why or contextualise why a new body has been established in Australia. This is a quote that some have already here commented that they saw in the tablet a few months ago. So, where have we come from in terms of the last 5 years of the Royal Commission? Someone mentioned before in the feedback from the previous session, I think John mentioned. So there were 8,000 private sessions actually that Royal Commissioners, there were 6 Royal Commissioners in Australia. So they met with 7,981 survivors of institutional abuse in just over 8,000 private sessions. And those sessions occurred between May 2013 and right up until the report was published in the middle of December last year. There were nearly 3,500 institutions, so our Royal Commission was very broad-ranging. So it was sporting groups, it was the Scouts and the Girl Guides, it was all major faith groups, it was private schools, it was private dance studios, it was Olympic sports development programs, so it was very broad-ranging. 58.1% of those organisations that were named in the private sessions were religious, and 32.5% were government, and just over 10 were non-government, non-religious, so independent, the likes of Berry Street, who I worked for a number of years ago. If we then look, this is the Royal Commission's data, if we then take a look at those that were in the private sessions, talked about being abused in religious institutions, there were just under 2,500 survivors. They named 964 Catholic institutions in Australia where abuse had occurred, so 27% of the total number of institutions were Catholic. And if you just look at the graph, it's a pretty obvious why the Catholic Church was up the top. So 61% of those who said they were abused in a religious institution, it happened in a Catholic institution. And then if you take it back to the sample of the 8,000, 36.2% of the survivors of the total, not just those in religious, but total, said they were abused in a Catholic institution. Then what the Church did in Australia, it worked with the Commission to actually then look at its own data. So those first slides I've shown you came from the people who came forward to talk to the Royal Commission. The second piece of work the Royal Commission did, with cooperation from over 200 Catholic institutions, was to examine the Catholic claim data that existed from January 1980 to February 2015. This had not been aggregated across church organisations. So in that period, just under 4,500 people had made claims to various Catholic institutions. I think Robin might have mentioned yesterday that the Royal Commission sort of ended up with an average time of disclosure from abuse to disclosure of 22 years. The Church's own data shows on average it was 33 years for disclosure from abuse in a Catholic institution. So on average 11 years longer for people to present to make a claim. And there were 1,049 institutions where those 4,500 people had made claims. Lost my button. Again, from the Church's own data, there were just over 1,800 perpetrators alleged in the 30-year period between 1950 and 1980. And again, John might have just mentioned some of these stats. He obviously had an Australian in his group. So there were 1,200 priests and religious offenders. 96% of the Catholic offenders were male, and 30%, a third, were lay people. The 70% were clergy religious. So one of the reasons, or two of the reasons really, that Catholic professional standards, or the myths that we're working with really, which also Archbishop Mark talked about earlier, is really still trying to confront the notion. Archbishop Mark talked about his journey. There are plenty still in Australia who do, unfortunately, still think that this was a few rotten apples. So part of our job is to continue to help those people understand the reality that we're dealing with. And the other myth, which the 33-year disclosure rate hopefully dispels for those in the room, is that it's all in the past. We fixed everything and we're fine today. If it takes on average 33 years for someone to come forward, we haven't heard from children who were abused in the 80s. Or they're just starting to come forward. And in fact, the Royal Commission, the other thing that the Royal Commission dispels, I don't have the data of how many were from Catholic institutions, but I think it was about 8 to 10%, Narelle might know better, of those private hearings were from children today. So they were not all historic cases. And there were several case studies that were about children who are still school age now. So this is not a historic issue for our institutions in Australia. So Catholic Professional Standards has been set up with 5 key purposes. So to articulate and set a framework for national Catholic safeguarding standards, which I'll come to in a moment, to provide ongoing training, support and expert advice in relation to those standards and everything that falls out of that in terms of practices in Catholic organisations, oversee and implement audits of compliance against those standards, publicly report the findings of those audits, and also provide advice to leaders of bishops, religious leaders and organisational leaders. So I wanted you to hear, I think again Robin might have mentioned this fellow yesterday, one of the commissioners, I mentioned there were 6, only one of them was a Catholic by background. His name's Robert Fitzgerald, and he's quite eminent in Australia and has been involved in leading Catholic ministries. He's been involved in health boards and education for many years. So we've done an interview with him. I want to show you just a couple of snippets to hear from him his perception as a Catholic, having sat and listened to both Catholic and other survivors and have heard the evidence over the 5 years. He's talked quite articulately for us around what do standards contribute to change. So we talked before about culture. So where do things like standards and regulation and reporting fit in Robert's frame of reference? So let me just play this. It only goes for about 1.5 minutes.
Why are safeguards and real sort of statutory requirements about safeguards, why do they matter?
Well, I think they matter in a couple of ways. Fundamentally, we want to create an institution that thinks and breathes about the safety of children. And it's an institution that acts in the best interest of children or vulnerable people. And to do that, there's a number of things that have to come together. One is there are external pressures, for example, regulations that people have to abide by. There's rules and regulations in relation to simplification about duties of care. But there's also internal mechanisms in an organisation that will make its child safe or not. And one of the big learnings out of the Royal Commission is just because the institution is dealing with children, whether it's a school or residential care area or sports club, we can't ever assume that in fact it is acting in the best interest of children. Safeguards actually help organisations to actually create a child-safe environment in a very practical way. From the very top, from the board, as I say, right through to the basement. So safeguarding standards are a way in which organisations and institutions are aiding in creating that child-safe environment.
So they can actually encourage and guarantee change, you suggest?
They guarantee change in 2 ways. One is there's going to be external pressure on organisations to change. There will be changes to mandatory reporting for child protection purposes.
That's state imposed.
Yeah. There will be changes for mandatory reporting to the police. There will be statutory-based mandatory or minimum standards that will be applied. Already happens in Queensland, South Australia, and Victoria. But when you're actually decided to be an institution, how do you actually change the attitude of the institution? How do you change the culture of the institution? And one of the ways you do that is actually change the practices of the institution. And standards, safeguards, are all about the practical manifestation of a mindset that says we want to keep children safe in this institution. And these are the means by which we can achieve that.
The interviewer there is a well-known Australian sort of religious journalist, Geraldine Doog. And you'll hear from Robert again in a couple of minutes. So our approach is really about, whilst our framework is set up to hold leaders to account, and I'll come back to that in a minute, our philosophy really is around making sure that the safety and protection of children and vulnerable adults is everyone's business in the church. And there has been lots of conversations about that over the last couple of days and again in just the last session, about the role of laity, about educating families, and everybody in the church seeing this as part of their responsibility. We're looking to keep children and vulnerable adults at the centre of what we're doing. Again, I've been quoted in the Australian media, now it'll be online, saying that I'll know that I've done a good job, not when the bishops tell me I've done a good job or the religious leaders, but when children can get me a message to say that they know who to go to if they feel unsafe, that they understand what their rights are and they get asked and respected for their opinion. That's when I'll know that our system is working in Australia. We're looking to try and examine culture, so to really look, whilst we're starting obviously with compliance as a framework, but what does it actually look like to measure and understand culture and cultural change in an organisation? And we're also looking to avoid duplication. People I've spoken to here this week know Australia has a federated system with states, child protection, regulation of education, and some of the systems the Catholic Church in Australia is still involved in is at a state level. So we've got 8 different jurisdictions we have to deal with for some of those things like mandatory reporting and education. So trying to, as much as possible, look at one church approach, but in a very multi-jurisdictional civil environment is really complicated, but we're pursuing that. So who are we? We are new for the Australian Church, so we are a company set up. The members, if you like, are the Bishops' Conference and Catholic Religious Australia, the Conference of Religious in Australia. And in the sort of day-to-day running, if you like, there are 2 representatives appointed from each of those groups. So we don't have to go back necessarily to seek approval of all of the bishops for our work, but there are certain things in our constitution where we do go back to the 4 member representatives. And there's also room in the constitution for other members, so other Catholic organisations to join the company as a member, if you like, and not just sign up to the standards. So one that we're talking to is St Vincent de Paul Society, for example, that's a national entity in Australia. The others would be, we have a relatively large group of now lay-led trustees overseeing health and education of some of the religious ministries, so public juridic persons. There's 11 or 12 of those currently in Australia, so they may join as an association as well. Then we have a board of directors who basically govern the day-to-day operations. And whilst the Constitution doesn't preclude membership of clergy or religious on the board, there are no clergy and religious on our board, and I don't think that would have necessarily worked in the current Australian context had there been one. Doesn't mean there won't be into the future. Good afternoon, Archbishop Mark. But there are, so our the skills and backgrounds of all of these people are on our website, but needless to say, they're pretty formidable. Those who come from Commonwealth countries might recognise that there's AMs and AOs and things after their name in terms of their recognition as leaders in their field, in the community. So we have a mixture of lawyers, we have education background, disability, governance expertise. Robin, who you met yesterday, is on our board, child protection and governance expert. So education, yes, and law as well.
Yep. Hello, Sheree. Do you have a term of office for the board?
Yep, 3 years and a maximum of 9. So three-year terms. The initial board directors, there were 3 who were appointed by the bishops and religious to start, and then since then they have worked on the skills that are required, and then there's a joint board and members group who look at the board members put to the members recommendations for the other board. So that it's not quite self-perpetuating yet, but it is the board driving the what's required to manage the day-to-day operations. So the company has been established to be functionally independent, as I mentioned, and that's very clear. Tim mentioned I started just 12 months ago in July, and we're physically located in Melbourne, which is sort of south of the country. But we obviously have national coverage for all activities of the church, although we are starting our focus with dioceses and congregations, which for us is about 220 organisations, 37 dioceses, eparchies and ordinariates, and just under 200 members of Catholic Religious Australia, but there are lots of groups who are not members either of those groups. Our first standards, our remit is children and vulnerable adults, but we have started with a focus on the standards to protect children. And in the second half of, this time next year, we'll start work on developing the indicators for vulnerable adults.
Sheree, may I ask the
Yep.
funding?
Yep. So the initial establishment has been funded jointly by the Bishops' Conference and Catholic Religious. So all of the dioceses and members of Catholic Religious Australia pay to support our work. But the intent is over the next 2 to 3 years, we'll look at much more targeted funding. So each individual entity will pay for the audit. So similar to the Irish model, where there's sort of currently a levy that keeps our operations running, and then we charge each of the entities for the audit activity based on size, complexity, risk, things like that. I haven't attributed him, but now he's in the room. So these 4 elements actually came from Archbishop Mark when he was giving evidence to the Royal Commission around what he saw as change of culture, and he's already articulated much of this earlier today. But these 4 elements definitely have informed some of our development of our role and our values moving forward. So awareness being raising increased awareness of everyone in the church community and beyond about child sexual abuse and child abuse, violence, and how not just that is perpetrated, but how can we strengthen our organisations to protect children and vulnerable adults. Accountability in terms of being clear and more transparent. Again, Archbishop Mark talked about that earlier. Consistency. So I mentioned we have 8 jurisdictions, but there is a desire of church leadership in Australia that we set a national set of standards. And again, the Royal Commission, we have had processes in Australia that have been national, but actually what the Royal Commission found was they were applied quite differentially across different states and between congregations, or between dioceses. So we're looking to re-establish some consistency, but also importantly to deal with all of those, again, as I said, taking children and vulnerable adults at the centre of our work with compassion. So that this isn't just about a statutory set of rules that could appear in a civil society, but this is very much driven by our church identity.
Sheree, can I also, sorry to interrupt you.
Yep.
I also asked to see, just for our work, in terms of the different jurisdictions, I know you haven't come to vulnerable adults yet, but is there a consistent definition amongst those, or is each state slightly different?
So we do have a current consistent approach that I understand sort of comes, anyway, I'm not sure where it comes from, but it's in our current Towards Healing, some of our national documents. But actually, ironically, as part of the current consultation on our children's standards, we've had feedback already about what a vulnerable adult means and how we define it. And in fact, some of the feedback is not dissimilar to what we've talked about today or over the last couple of days, that actually the issue with our definition is it puts the responsibility on effectively the victim instead of defining perhaps the potential perpetrator. So the power relationship being key to that. So instead of trying to define a broad group of potential victims, let's focus on the power. So we've got work to do to understand and pick that apart, and we'll start that next year.
Thank you.
There is a definition in our constitution if you want to look at what it actually says.
So my understanding is that you don't work with any cases, right? You're just about policy and audits and prevention.
Yes.
And does casework inform your practice in any way?
Excuse me. Well, the way it informs practice at the moment is the background of the staff that we had, that we all have a clinical background, but our remit is not to deal with cases in an ongoing way. So it is to set the standards and then to look at the complaint handling within each institution to understand, and I'll come to it in a minute in terms of how we're then being informed by survivors, but also children today to make sure that we stay relevant. Yeah.
So do you have a monitoring system to ensure compliance?
I'll come to that. We're developing it at the moment. So we're only 12 months old, so we're working pretty fast. So I just wanted to these are another couple of points just about changing culture. And again, the bishops and religious who set up the company were very clear in the Constitution about increased transparency and accountability. So again, I just want to flick to Robert Fitzgerald, who articulated this really, really well from his perspective, having sat at the Royal Commission.
One of the greatest problems for religious institutions has been the failure of transparency. The single greatest failure of the Catholic Church and others was a culture that in fact didn't want to be transparent. Everything was done secretly. It wasn't only to the public, it was to the people of the churches themselves. Even their own clergy were kept in the dark about the extent of the abuse. And so one of the things going forward is that we need a culture in institutions generally, and churches in particular, that actually embrace transparency. Transparency about things that go wrong. Transparency about the responses to those things that have gone wrong. But also transparency about how they're actually going to improve things and fix things. And that's a very different mindset for institutions that have traditionally been private, secretive, and believing that the less people know, the better it is. So it's a very big change. Trying to deal with the breach of trust that's occurred between the community and religious institutions is absolutely vital. The church has to be seen not only to embrace good standards and good practices, it has to be publicly accountable. It has to be accountable firstly to its own people, which is not all, and secondly to the people at large. I don't think the trust in churches can be restored until the publication of the standards, the publication of the orders, in fact, is undertaken. And that will be a challenge for many in church and in many other institutions. But unless that occurs, I don't think the community will be back, nor necessarily should be back, trust institutions. The days of being secret, of internalising these issues, of not telling people what's happening, I think they will truly pass. And if they haven't, then in fact the church will never restore the trust of people.
So, with that in mind, let's move to the actual standards and what the framework is that we're looking to. And in fact, the Royal Commission has given us a blueprint. But first of all, just some principles in terms of what we're looking at as a child-safe organisation that picks up some of what Robert has talked about and very much the work of the Royal Commission, but also others around the world. So I won't go through each of those. And I should have said also that the slides will come out through Tim, so you shouldn't be scribbling notes. Sorry, I should have said that at the start. Sorry. So how do we go about developing what's currently a draft set of standards that are out for consultation in Australia at the moment? So, in fact, the Royal Commission gave us a basis. So they did quite an extensive piece of research in about year 2 to 3 of the Commission, where they looked at they did a Delphi study internationally looking at what were the elements that created child-safe institutions across all sorts of contexts. And those in the final report, when the Commission published its report in December last year, they published them as a set of high-level principle-based standards for any organisation in Australia to take on. So we decided that there was no point going and reinventing the wheel, and in fact the purpose of the standards from the Royal Commission's perspective, amongst many of their recommendations, was federal and state governments in fact take those on and create a regulatory environment across all sorts of institutions. But their standards were designed to then be adapted to the context. So they needed to be able to work if it was a dance studio, if it was the YMCA or the Catholic Church. So that's what we did, and we developed our first sort of reflection of what they would look like if you turn them into, looked at the Catholic Church context. There There were also a number of recommendations, some of which I'll touch on in a minute, that outside the standards that referred specifically to religious institutions, and Robert in that previous video was not necessarily just talking about the Catholic Church, he was talking about all the religious institutions before the Commission. And then there was some that was specifically related to the Catholic Church. So we also looked at all of those and how they would then impact and fall into a set of requirements. And in the first 6 months of myself being in this role, I got on the road literally, or in a plane probably more frequently, and traversed the country and met with probably about 2/3 of the diocese and maybe about 1/3 of congregations, to try and get a sense of what was still the issues for people on the ground. And there was very clear alignment between people's practical experience and what the Royal Commission was suggesting. So we had a draft, we did a second draft, and developed the start of some guidance and shared terminology, and then turned them into more of a measurable format. So already I'm hearing from the team at home that there's some questions. So language might have changed slightly between what the Royal Commission actually said and what we've got. Some of that's to do with how you go about measuring. The Royal Commission talked about principles. It's very hard to actually practically audit against a principle. So we've done some translation into more practical language that can be actually measured, but we've got some work to do to educate people about why we've done that. And we've broken each of the standards into some criteria. The Royal Commission had done a little bit of that. And then we've also given a start of sort of similar to the Irish model, some examples of how yes, thank you, Niall, of how we go about then, what would that look like on the ground in a church organisation. And we, with permission, plagiarised Irish indicators. Although that's a serious point, I think that's the other thing that's been reinforced for me this week is internationally we're dealing with these same issues. So in fact, the same indicators should apply. And in fact, we can then start sharing the language across cultures about what's working and what's not working, instead of all still going back into our sort of local context. Of course, there are different things that apply, but there's a lot that can carry forward. And I think the more we do this together, the better. And the final draft, which is here, and I have 6 copies, so the first to the front can take a copy, or they're on our website. The final version, we've partnered with KPMG, one of the big consulting firms, but to actually then help us do some of that translation into actually how do you measure some of these things? How do you take a principle and put it on the ground to measure? So in terms of a high-level overview, the Royal Commission gave us 10 standards. There's 43 criteria, 84 indicators. The key issue here is these are the things that we added. So we kept what the Royal Commission gave us, which was 35 criteria. We've turned them into, contextualised them for church. But then we've added some 8 extras, and those come from a mix of, as I mentioned before, some of the Royal Commission recommendations, but also actually from talking to church personnel on the ground now. So there is some specific coverage, an issue that's come up today over the last couple of days around, oh no, this one hasn't. So overseas ministries and activities. So we're an Australian-based, more often than not a congregation, not a diocese, has governance canonical responsibility for missions offshore. The standards apply, even though that country they're working with may not have the same, obviously, civil laws and things. So we're talking about PNG, Solomons, in the Pacific, in Southeast Asia and Africa. The second one, the church entity takes the leadership role in raising community awareness. So again, this has come up in these days, that it's not just about us looking at ourselves, but actually leading and educating the broader community around child safeguarding and protection of all children, whether in an institution or in their family context. That came from both the Royal Commission and Australian church leaders asking for us to look at that. Risk management of offenders, so this isn't clergy or church personnel, this is congregants who might come to Mass who then have a history. So how do we broadly protect our community? Management and movement of clergy has been touched on. Formation's been a big issue here today, these couple of days. Overseas personnel, again, is a theme that's come up. So those missionaries who are coming to Australia from very different cultural backgrounds to ours, and how do we help them understand the boundaries that are acceptable and the laws that are acceptable in Australia. And then we've added 2 that came from us. So in recognition of the Royal Commission rightfully set their standards as looking forward, we've added 1 similar to Ireland around care of complainants, so those who've come forward and who are still coming forward. What's the care and response for them, pastorally, spiritually, psychologically, and also mechanisms in place to monitor and support respondents. So how are we also then supporting those who have an allegation against them, and what happens during their journey through the complaint process. So I've probably already touched on this, but it is the intention that over time the standards would be applied to all church ministries in Australia. And there's some other points there. Now pushing the wrong button. So just to give you a high-level understanding of the 10 elements of the standards. So the first one, we've again talked a lot about this in the last couple of days, but really focuses on leadership, culture and governance. And standards around and requirements around safeguarding across leadership, culture and governance. And that is underpinned by commitment to safeguarding children and vulnerable adults from abuse. So the overt public commitment, and I'll come back and talk about that in a moment. Then the policies and procedures. So what does the diocese or congregation or the Catholic Care or McKillop Robbins organisation or a health service, what are the policies and procedures that then really back up that public commitment and put it into practice on the ground? And really key to that is screening. So we're only then screening for safe people. That includes our formation and, as we've talked about, but also of our lay staff. Then once we have the people in the organisation, what education and training are we providing to them, both initially so that they understand the culture and the requirements, but on an ongoing basis. And again, we've talked about that in terms of formation for clergy, but it's just as important for lay staff that they are continually updated and refreshed on these things. Then reporting procedures, so again, being clear that you have them, that you know, and that everybody in the organisation appropriately knows what to do when a complaint comes in. Again, I was fortunate enough to spend a couple of days with Niall in Ireland, and we're talking about, the gardener in the church does need to know what to do, because someone might just come and say something to them while they're pruning the roses. So and they do. Or the flower arranger, or the coordinator of the altar servers. So it's not just clergy and religious and leaders who need to then understand how to apply the policies and procedures. Everybody needs to be able to respond appropriately. We need to focus on our physical and online environments. So the Australian standards do talk about online safety, but also the sort of physical considerations of any environment. That includes camps and all sorts of things. And an inclusive approach. So our Australian standards also talk about, making sure that information is available in languages appropriately, cross-culturally, that it is inclusive, and that leadership does, again, Archbishop Mark spoke about this, but that there's inclusivity in how we approach this. And then that we have second last element is that there is not just our body to monitor and review, but within organisations there are systems over time that help monitor, review and continually look to improve and stay. I think someone earlier said vigilance is critical, that this is not an activity that you do once and then say, well, I've got a great policy, I've trained everyone, we're all fine. This is a constant and very fast-moving and evolving space to be in and stay on top of. And then the last element is that there are 2 standards that really focus. One focuses on children and one focuses on family and community. So that notion of opening up what we're doing in any organisation to empower children, inform children and have children's genuine involvement, but equally that families understand what's happening within the institution and what the expectations are. Don't know how my time's going. I've probably gone way over, have I, Annette? So 15 minutes over, sorry. I've got maybe a couple more slides. So the house gives you the sort of high level. These few slides just talk more specifically about the sort of detail in them, but hopefully the little walk through the house has given you the idea of how the framework fits together. So I might not necessarily go through each of these in detail. I'll just flick through them because I've got about 3 slides left, I think, once I get through those. Okay, so just to touch on, so I mentioned before there were recommendations. So there were 37 recommendations outside the standards that applied to religious organisations and the Catholic Church specifically. There were a lot more, but 37 of those have found their way into the standards, and they're just some examples. So there were some specific things, say for example, in Standard 1, which was around governance and culture. That's where there was a recommendation around the notion of parishioners who might have had convictions and how when a priest becomes aware, not necessarily going out and asking everyone to sign a declaration, but when there's someone known in the community that might pose a risk, that they make an attempt to manage that risk and support that person. So that's one example. And then there were 44 other recommendations, some of which Archbishop Mark talked about before, so the governance review being one of them, that isn't necessarily our responsibility, but we're keeping a watching brief on. Some of them were related to church specifically, as I just mentioned, but some of them also relate to the statutory environment in which we're operating. And while we've been away, the Australian government has released its response to the Royal Commission, and the ACT government has released its response, and the other states, I believe, have all committed to do it by the end of next week, by the end of June. And that will have, there are legal changes in Australia almost every day in this space, and that will continue to change over the next little while. So we've got a piece of work to do to make sure that we stay connected to what's happening in the civil context. I'll just put this up quickly. So someone asked before how we're going about auditing. So what we're doing at the moment is we've had a period of time where people have been able to sort of submit some comments on the draft standards. And as I mentioned, the team are going around the country now talking with church authorities about the audit approach and how we might go about actually deploying an audit approach on the ground. We're getting very interesting feedback, as you might imagine. But we've put out a couple of models, and we're talking with people about how that would look. And the plan.
Who's actually going to do the audit?
Yep. So I'll just finish this, and then I'll come back to that. So we're also testing. So we've done a benchmarking exercise right back at the start, back here with the diocese, where we went in and sort of just desktop looked at what they already had and what were we asking and what the gap was. And in July, we will do 3 pilot audits, one in another diocese and 2 congregations, a male and a female congregation. And that will test the audit methodology and help us tweak that before we finalise it. And the idea is that all of this is done by September. So we're working very hard. In terms of who will deliver the audits, the majority of the audits we will outsource to audit firms, but not the big KPMG ones, but to audit practitioners who are used. In Australia, we have a very strong performance audit culture in our social services and in our health, and it's all done by outsourced providers from sort of sole operators up to the big 4. We're not thinking that we'll be able to afford the big 4, but we would look to mid-range. And in fact, there are some parts of church activities that are already audited. So Catholic Care, where I came from, which is part of the diocesan structure, is already audited, and I think 80% of the diocesan Catholic cares are audited by one firm already. So they know and understand church governance a little bit, so it might be that they come onto a panel and then a diocese could make a decision. We'll also have a small internal audit team, and that's where we'll keep our practice connected as well. Just to touch on that, in line with the standards, we're also doing a strategy of consulting with children. So there's a child-friendly version, both for low primary school and early secondary school, that is sitting in my email somewhere for me to read. And the plan is that we're going to put that out to dioceses and those working with young people directly today to run some consultations, and we're giving them some frameworks for how they might do that in a school context or a children's liturgy context or a youth ministry context. And then we'll seek feedback from children themselves before we finish the final version of the standards. So trying to model and also develop resources that church, dioceses and congregations can use practically. And dissimilar or different to Ireland and maybe some other contexts as I understand it, and again this was mentioned earlier, we still have a very rigorous or very extensive, I should say, service delivery footprint in education, in health and in social services across Australia. And if we were to stop delivering those services, all three of those systems would fall over. So 40% of children are in Catholic schools, roughly? 20, not quite that high. 25% of children in Australia are in a Catholic school. So
if we... Still run by the diocese?
Yeah. Either by congregations or PJPs or parish schools. So if we stopped those today, the education system would fall over. Equally health, both public health and private health is a very big sector. So, and social services. So we're looking to work with those. They already have quite robust standards, but not necessarily specifically relating to child safeguarding. So yes, they might have some nice general governance standards, but it doesn't necessarily dig into some of the detail that we're looking at in elements of safeguarding. So we've got a piece of work to do to work with those industries and those regulators. So our commitment is to not re-regulate, and the Royal Commission certainly said don't go and re-measure these people first. But there is still a desire that we reach a national standard across Catholic services. So they still will have work to do, but we've got a piece of work to do to map that gap and be clear about that. I won't talk about the audit framework. I'll skip that. There's a whole lot of other work we're doing, but I'll finish with this. And it comes back to Robert Fitzgerald. So I asked him at a discussion with our board what he saw as the key elements to create a child-safe institution or organisation. And so he talked about three things. And if you remember the slide I had about the 4 elements of culture that Archbishop Mark had mentioned, there's some significant alignment. So a community that's committed, and not just committed on paper, but actually has taken on an understanding of the need for safeguards and are committed, publicly commit to it and stand by that commitment. Knowledge, a community of knowledge. So understanding not just about how to do safeguarding and what the policies and structures need to be, but have real appropriate knowledge about signs to look for, about warning and indicators, about signs that Robin talked about of trauma in children, how to pick up those signs, and a conversation. So a genuine, open conversation at all levels of an organisation, and a public commitment and action to children's rights and seeing children as having inherent dignity and not just not having inherent dignity. So that's Robert's quote that I wanted to finish on. And feel free to get in touch. I have business cards and I have copies of the standards. Thank you.
It might have been going to be over time, but I think everybody was totally involved. You did an amazing job trying to explain such a complex system values, you'd like to just say a little bit.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Andrew.
So who deals with cases for you?
So incidents,